Yeah.
Yes, which takes me a second on mine, but that's perfect actually, Pete, because I was trying to scramble around to try and find what your title was. So I'm glad that you put it up for me. We're recording now, so welcome everybody to what is our 58th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. It's the first one that's gone head to head with a European Championships football match. So you've got a choice of Peter Dawson from the University of East Anglia or Sweden versus Slovakia, which I'm reliably informed is goalless at the moment. Peter is going to present on and off-field behaviour of match officials in professional team sports. Peter, you have 60 minutes to talk in, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. And I don't wish to take up any more of your time, especially for those who might want to watch this and then get on and see the end of the game. So, Peter, please do take away your talk.
Okay, thank you very much, James, and thank you everybody for joining today. Thank you very much for the invite. I'm happy to take questions as I go along, so do feel free to kind of interrupt. I know James has said he will monitor the chat, monitor any kind of hand raising, frantic waving of hands as the presentation goes on, and obviously there's hopefully be plenty of time at the end to for some discussion. And not only is it competing with the football, this is a different sport altogether. So, so this is joint work. So as James has said, this is about match officials, looking at match officials on and off the field. It's joint work with Patrick Massey and Paul Downward. Patrick Pat is the expert on Pro 14 and the rugby tournament that we look at in this paper. So I'm happy to deal with any specific questions about it, but there'll be probably less than they'll be a bit thin in terms of detail potentially. But I'm happy to field anything if you've got anything specific in relation to that. And just also to note, I think this has already been previously advertised on Twitter, but this is all elements of this talk is based on a chapter in a forthcoming book that Robbie Butler has edited. I think there are several people in the room today on the call who are also contributed to this. So in Advances in Sports Economics. So I don't know if Robbie's here, but I'm plugging his book. A few more royalties maybe. I don't know what his commission is. Okay, so what's the motivation behind this piece of work? Well, it's unsurprising. Everybody knows that's familiar with this kind of area that home advantage is quite a commonly observed phenomena in lots of different sports. So here are just some examples. This is the average rate of home wins across Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, and close to home, English Premier League for fairly recent seasons. These are seasons obviously prior to COVID-19. So obviously the average number of home wins is fairly high. And this is also the case in the sport that we consider here. So we're going to be considering the case of rugby, specifically rugby union, where the average rate across many different papers, the average rate of home wins is consistently above 60%. So we know that home advantage is quite significant, and obviously lots of research have started to consider or have considered explanations for this phenomenon. But before I go into some specific details in relation to that, just to provide you with a bit further motivation, and you might be asking why we chose rugby for this investigation. So firstly, as you'll see, we look at essentially disciplinary sanctions, and it's work I've done in this area before, but it's arguably some sanctions such as yellow cards have more of an immediate impact compared to other sports. So sports such as soccer, so obviously the brandishing of a yellow card in soccer is a caution to the recipient, but remains on the field of play. But whereas in rugby, a yellow card results in a period of time, typically 10 minutes, also known as a sin bin, where the player is temporarily removed from the field. So arguably, it could potentially have more of an immediate impact in terms of match outcomes. We don't explore that here. We are undertaking some other research which is looking at the kind of impact of sin bins in a couple of separate studies. And then the other aspect why we choose the specific tournament. So we're looking at what I will describe as the Pro 14, but it has now, or will be changing its name from next season. It has gone through a number of name changes in the past, which I'll talk a little bit about later. The reason we choose this particular league is first that it involves teams from different countries, but it also involves match officials from different countries. So there is some interesting and potentially unique kind of interplay there between teams from different nationalities and also match officials from different countries. And to kind of show you a couple of match-based examples. So as I say, I'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of the composition of the tournament and the participants. So those of you not familiar with rugby, not familiar with this particular tournament, may have no idea who the Ospreys are, who Benetton are, might have more than, maybe have some understanding who Leinster and Cardiff are in terms of geographical locations, but essentially Ospreys versus Benetton. So Ospreys Welsh team, Benetton Italian team, and so this was a match that was played this last season. So this was where Ospreys were playing at home, and if you look specifically at the composition of the referee team, if you like, so what we're particularly interested in here is the nationality, the country of origin of the on-field referee. So here the main referee, so this would be the on-field referee, and the off-field referee. So in rugby, these are known as the television match official. So it's the equivalent of VAR in football, for example. And you can see in that first game that I've highlighted here, you can see that the composition of all the referee team is exclusively from Wales. So in particular, the main referee, the on-field referee, and the off-field television match official are both Welsh. Whereas, and obviously that matches the nationality of the home team. Whereas in the second example here, we have what we describe as a neutral on-field referee, so Scottish referee, because Leinster's Irish, Cardiff Welsh, obviously, but the TMO is from Ireland. So it is this kind of interplay, there's these kind of variations that we're potentially interested in here in terms of, does it actually matter? Does it actually matter in terms of whether there is a television match official? And then secondly, does it matter about the nationality of either the on-field referee or the off-field referee match official? So that gives a bit further kind of motivation for this particular study. So this is what I'm going to do. I'll talk a little bit about some previous studies in this kind of general area of home advantage, but specifically looking at the effects of referees potentially being biased and inconsistent. I'll talk a little bit about the Pro 14 rugby, and then I'll move on to the empirical analysis. So I'll talk a little bit about the data, the methodology, provide you with a kind of sketch of some of the results, and then some brief concluding remarks. But as I said at the start, happy to take questions as we go through. Okay, so for many people, many of you actually here, probably very familiar with a lot of the previous studies in this area. So I won't spend too long talking about this, but to give a kind of flavour in terms of where we're currently at in terms of previous studies. So if we look specifically at on-field match officials, and specifically looking at football, Then there's lots of studies which have found that the on-field match referee tends to issue more yellow and red cards to the away team. They tend to award more penalties to the home team. And so that's specifically in the case of disciplinary sanctions. In the case of added on time, there's also evidence to suggest that when the home team is behind, there's tendency for more time added on to be given, and less when the team is ahead. And Doman and Salmon provided a nice kind of overview of many of those studies in relation to that area. And whilst it's not the focus of this particular paper, because we're looking at the interplay between an on-field match official and the off-field match official, there are obviously a number of other studies which have looked at increasing the number of on-field officials. Tended to generate mixed results. One fairly recent study here by Albanese colleagues suggests that in football, the additional assistant referee in European Cup competitions tended to reduce, potentially eliminate referee bias. And obviously, kind of factors influencing this, the most prominent has been in terms of the behaviour of the crowd, and tendency for them to influence decision making on these on-field match referees, and this has become quite apparent in quite lots of studies. Clearly, in the case most recently, because of COVID-19 and the absence of crowds, there's lots of quasi-natural experiments. Obviously, the work that James has been involved with, but there are others as well. So I'm not listing them all here. I'm just listing a few that I'm perhaps more familiar with than others. The extent to which crowd matters might be mediated by the kind of architecture, the design of the stadium. So if there's a running track, so if the fans are further away, how full the stadium is, again, these things potentially matter. But what I'm particularly interested in here, whilst this study I'm going to show you today will control for crowd effects, in particular, what I'm interested in here is this kind of implicit preferences and identities. So the extent to which nationality, for example, might provide another salient cue to the officials. And obviously, this is work, some work in this area previously. And again, not to be too self-serving, there's also some evidence to suggest that more experienced officials tend to be less prone to bias. So some of these aspects, obviously the crowd effects, the experience of the officials, will be included in the model I'm going to show you shortly, and they'll act obviously as control variables, but in particular I'm interested in these kind of nationality effects and whether these shared nationalities between the on and off field referees and the teams competing makes any difference. So there has been some work in terms of off-field assistance. Most of this is obviously fairly recent because the introduction of video-assisted referees or television match officials have been a fairly recent phenomena. Perhaps less so in rugby. They've been around for the best part of 10, 15, in some cases over 20 years. But there is some evidence to suggest in some of the American sports, in baseball, for example, that having off-field assistance improves the accuracy of decisions. And this is particularly the case for kind of less experienced officials. They can contribute to reducing shirking. And in the case of cricket, no evidence to suggest that the decision review system contributes to home bias. So there's been a small but growing number of studies in relation to off-field assistance. But there's been fewer studies just generally that have investigated referee bias in relation to rugby. And again, I'm not identifying every single study here, but two which are perhaps most relevant to what we're investigating here. So Page and Page in 2010, I think it's still a working paper. I don't think it has been published, but what they look at was whether the shared national identity with the referee, so for example, if the home team, if the referee had the same nationality as the home team, for example, then this increased the likelihood of favourable decisions in relation to penalties awarded and yellow cards, for example. And then another one of my studies fairly recently looked at the impact of the introduction of the television match official in European club rugby. So this is what's currently is known as the Heineken Cup, the European Rugby Cup, but also the European Rugby Challenge Cup. And we found that this had the introduction of the TMO influenced the incidence of sanctions. So yellow cards, red cards, penalty tries to both teams. So essentially this study that I'm going to present to you today combines some of the elements of both of these papers here. So we're looking at the impact of the introduction of the TMO in another rugby competition, but in particular we're also bringing in this idea of national identity and whether the nationality of the on and off field referee is making a difference to sanctions. So just in case anybody does actually want to leave and watch the remainder of the Sweden-Slovakia game, here are the kind of main highlights from the study. So we find that the presence of a third-party assistance to the television match official generally increases sanctions, and that's across both the home team and the away team. We also find that variations exist across on-field officials of different nationalities. Now, you'll have to take that on trust because I'm not actually going to show you that in this particular presentation. You can see more details of that if you actually purchase the book. You'll see the details of that in the chapter. That's slightly joking when I'm saying that, but I'm not going to talk about that in this presentation too much. But what I want to do in particular is look at what happens when the on-field official shares the same nationality as the home team. So we find some evidence to suggest that when the on-field official shares the same nationality as the home team, there are some potential biases, but actually this is reduced in the presence of an off-field assistant. So in other words, when the TMO is present, the bias is reduced. So there are kind of headlines, if you like. We'll be exploring the basis behind this as we proceed. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what is currently known as Pro 14 Rugby. So this is an annual rugby competition. It involves clubs from Ireland, Italy, Scotland, South Africa and Wales. So obviously, as I said at the start, what's nice about this tournament, obviously, it is involving clubs from a number of different countries. Wasn't always like that. So this is the I tend not to kind of quote from Wikipedia, but seeing as it's been quoted before in some recent Roses seminars, I thought I'd follow suit. So just to kind of give you some kind of geographical visualization of the location of the Pro 14 clubs, although strictly speaking, these are the locations of the clubs as will be competing from next season. So next season, 2021-22. So you've got 4 clubs in Ireland, 1 in Northern Ireland, 3 in Southern Ireland, the Republic. You've got 2 in Scotland, 4 in Wales, 2 in Italy, and this is where the kind of change has taken place. So fairly recently, was the introduction of teams from South Africa coming into the competition. So initially there was 2, then I think one of them had financial difficulties, so dropped out. None of them competed in the most recent season because of COVID, but from 2021-22 there will now be 4 South African teams competing. So the number of clubs involved in the tournament will increase again. And to give you an idea of how things have evolved over time in relation to the tournament. So it started out in 2001. It was known as the Celtic League, 15 teams. and these were teams from exclusively Ireland, Wales and Scotland. Increased in 2002, 2003, but then there was a period in which the number of clubs reduced over the period 2003 to 2009, and then there was a period of expansion. So the Italian teams entered the competition in 2010, and this is where you've got the first name change to the Pro 12. Following the additional inclusion of the two of the South African teams, it was then renamed Pro 14. And then, as I showed on the previous image, with the further introduction of two additional South African teams, it's now going to be renamed the United Rugby Championship from 2021-22. But for the purposes of the talk here, even though the sample period does cover the entirety up to from the start, or very close to the start, to 2018-19, I'm just going to call it the Pro 14 as it currently exists. Okay. So that gives you a bit of idea, kind of the composition of the tournament, the number of teams competing over time. But obviously, there also has been some refereeing changes, and again, there are some nice kind of useful insights here, which we kind of exploit in the analysis that follows. So prior to 2007-8, referees were appointed from a country not involved in the match, unless both teams were from the same country. So if it was two Irish teams, then it could be an Irish on-field match official, for example. In 2007-8, that neutrality assumption was dropped, and that same season, the television match official was introduced. And then in 2016-17, there was the introduction of neutral TMOs and one neutral assistant on-field assistant official. So we're going to exploit some of these refereeing changes in our analysis. So as I've just said, our data set covers all Pro 14 matches played from 2003-4 to 2018-19. So we don't have the first two seasons, and we don't have the most recent seasons. I say we don't have the most recent season. I recently hired an intern to kind of collect some data in relation to the two most recent seasons, but we don't include them in this analysis here. So we've only just received that data. So going back to what I said at the start in terms of home advantage, this is what the kind of average home advantage is over each of those seasons in our sample period. Now, just before the call, just before the presentation started, about half an hour before, I thought, well, maybe I should try and explain what's happening here in 2006, 2007, and I failed miserably to try and offer a potential explanation as to why the average home advantage was so much higher in 2006, 2007. I was thinking that maybe some of the clubs competing in that particular season had done well in other European competitions in the previous season, which might have affected home advantage in that particular season, but it wasn't clear. So it's not immediately obvious why there's the kind of much larger average here compared to the other seasons, but there's no obvious trend. There's no obvious pattern. Obviously, there are periods where it's increasing, but there's then periods of where it's kind of declining. So on average, as I said at the start, it's typically well above 60%. So there's only one season where it's actually below 60%, and only one season where it's above 70%. So it's fairly consistent over time. And just to kind of, again, just to give you a flavour of the data. So as I said, we're looking here at sanctions, so yellow cards, red cards, and the awarding of penalty tries. So not penalties, but looking at specifically penalty tries here. And the distributions are similar to what we would find in other sports such as football, in the sense that red cards and penalty tries are relatively rare. So there are fewer red cards and penalty tries in comparison to yellow cards. If you think about football as a reference point, there are fewer yellow cards in rugby than in football, partly because obviously the issuing of a yellow card in rugby, as I said earlier, involves the ejection of that player for a period of time from the field of play. But obviously what is apparent in all three of these tables is a tendency for the away team to incur more sanctions relative to the home team. So, for example, here, the matches where the away team incurs one yellow card and the home team doesn't. This is over double the alternative where you've got the home team incurring one yellow card and the away team incurring no yellow cards. So there is an obvious, and again, this is consistent with what we see in many other sports, including football, where the tendency for the away team to incur more sanctions than the home team. So how do we actually go about in terms of modelling this? So I was going to spend a little bit of time just going through the equations that we've set up here. So what we have here is the outcome variable, and the outcome variable is formed of constructed in different ways. So we look at an outcome variable based on yellow cards only, and we look at an outcome variable based on what we describe as a composite measure. So the composite measure essentially combines yellow cards, red cards, and penalty tries. Now, obviously, these could be modelled as counts, and obviously they are counts because it's the counts in terms of the number of yellow cards, the number of red cards, the number of penalty tries. But given what I just showed you on that previous slide, obviously the majority offences are typically in the region of either 0 or 1 yellow card, or 0 and 1 red card, or indeed 0 and 1 penalty try. The multiple yellow cards and multiple red cards and penalty tries are obviously rarer. So the way that we model this, even though we describe these outcome variables as latent variables, and they are observed, but we construct them based on a discrete choice framework. So we use a binary framework, binary probit framework for the yellow cards, and these are bivariate models. Okay? So we're modeling these, the home team and the away team here, simultaneously. So we're using a bivariate binary probit framework for the yellow cards, and then we're using a ordinal probit framework. So again, a bivariate ordinal probit framework for the composite measure. I also check these in relation to the count models. The count models are quite difficult, and there are difficult in terms of sometimes they don't converge. So we prefer to use these kind of discrete choice frameworks, but the results where they do converge for the count models are similar. And unsurprisingly, I've done this a lot. So here are just a few examples of where I've used this framework in the past. So, so we've got the home team and the away team. We've got the outcome variables here, which represent number of yellow cards based on a binary framework. So obviously, if it's 1 or more yellow card, it's coded as 1, 0 otherwise. And then for the composite measure, we use a 3 outcome. So 0, 1, and 2. So if it's 2 or more, then it's coded as 2 in the framework here. So in terms of the right-hand side, so our kind of key variables here represent the off-field assistance, the television match official, and as I mentioned earlier, we're interested in the nationality, neutrality, the on-field match official as well. And again, where I'm going to show you something that's a kind of add-on to what we talked about in the in the book chapter is also looking at the nationality of the television match official. So what I'm going to show you in the results which will follow is firstly what happens when we introduce a television match official and how that affects decision making in terms of sanctions. Then show you what happens when we look at the neutrality of the, or otherwise, on the on-field referee, and then show you something very briefly in relation to the kind of interplay between the nationality of the TMO with the on-field referee. So there are kind of key variables, and then we have a series of controls, and these controls match those kind of control factors mentioned earlier. So influences of the crowd, the experience of the on-field referee. We also kind of control for year and team effects and some of the specifications as well. There's a fairly limited, and we also have what could be described as a fairly rough proxy for quality of the teams based on current form. But you'll see that shortly. And obviously these are bivariate frameworks, so we're assuming the probit frameworks, so means of 0, variances of 1, and row obviously down between -1 and +1 to allow for a correlation between the error terms there. Okay. So to give you an idea of what, in terms of observations we have in terms of the on-field official and TMO, the off-field assistants. In the majority of games in this sample period, the on-field official is neutral. So in other words, has a different nationality to either of the two competing teams. So there are some cases in which the nationality is the same as the home team, but it's relatively rare. There are slightly more cases where the on-field official has the same nationality as the away team. For the television match official, there's actually more television match officials that have the same nationality as the home team, fewer kind of neutral TMOs, and very rare to have the TMO having the same nationality as the away team. So we're going to kind of exploit or look at essentially in a little while the neutrality of the on-field official with the neutrality of the television match official and how that might vary when the television match official has the same nationality as the home team. But that's to say, that's something I'm going to come back to right towards the end of the empirical analysis. And these are just the just to summarize the variables that we're using. So our dependent variables, we've got two different compositions, as I've said earlier. So we've got the yellow cards, which is in binary form, and then we've got this composite measure, which we treat as ordinal, which combines yellow cards, red cards, and penalty tries. So these are the control variables that we have. So I've already kind of mentioned a couple of these. So we've got the match attendance, the attendance ratio, so how full the stadium is, the experience of the on-field match official, which is based on the number of appearances of that official prior to the current game. We've got when the game is taking place at the game time, whether the match is a derby, so in other words, if it's a match involving teams from the same nation, and then two measures here which roughly proxy, we don't have betting data, but these roughly proxy the quality / form of the competing teams. So the home win ratio and the away win ratio, which is the win ratios from the previous 6 games for the home and away team. Okay, and this is just simply copied and pasted from Status. That's really lazy of me, but hence why I had to put how they're defined in Stata in the brackets here. But this gives you gives you an idea of the kind of distribution. So it's about a quarter of all matches are derbies. On average, the on-field match official had just under 30 appearances in terms of experience in the Pro 14. Attendance is a lot smaller than typically find in, well, certainly in top division football, but even probably even higher than Oldham Athletics average attendance. Sorry, just had to get that in. And the average capacity is typically about 50% full on average stadiums. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time in terms of the results. So I'm happy to pause. I don't know if there's anything that's come in on the chat or any hand raises or any questions, but I'm happy to pause just briefly before I go through the results, just in case there is anything anybody wants to know.
I'm trying to unmute.
No, I don't hear anything, so I'll carry on. And obviously, as I said at the start, if you have any questions, obviously do feel free to interrupt. Okay, so first set of results I'm showing you here. So these are for the bivariate binary probit models. So this is where we've got yellow cards.
Peter, just to interrupt you, I was having technical issues there. Alex Farnell has asked, do reds include straight reds and 2 yellows? So
there is no such thing as 2 yellows in rugby. So basically, if a player is issued with a yellow card, then they leave the field for 10 minutes and then they return. If they, it's fairly rare, but it can happen that they might then receive another yellow, but then it just means another 10 minutes off the field of play. So 2 yellows doesn't mean a red in rugby effectively. It will just mean 2 separate 10-minute spells off the field.
Okay.
So words of red is similar to obviously football, whereby if a player receives a red card, then they're permanently removed from the field of play for the duration of the
Kiddoke. And just one other question I had for clarification was, you're presenting the home advantage essentially as the proportion of wins by the home team, and is that because there's a balanced schedule in the Pro 14 league?
So it has been for the period that we look at. It's a balanced schedule. I know more recently they've had 2 separate conferences, so they've split. But I think that is since the sample period ends.
Okay.
So I'm pretty sure. I'd have to check that, but yeah, yeah, it's a kind of everybody plays home and away. All teams. As I say, the only recent change I think has been the divisional or the conference format which they introduced, but I'm pretty sure they only introduced that over the last couple of seasons, so it doesn't interfere with the sample period being used. But thank you both for your question.
Okay.
So I'll carry on. Okay, so as I say, I'm going to show you various sets of results here. So this is, as I mentioned, this is for yellow cards only, and this is our bivariate binary probit results. And so these aren't marginal effects here. Typically, the marginal effects for the TMO ranges between 3 percentage points and 10 percentage points, depending on the composition of the outcomes here. So we've got obviously the 2 equations, the home yellows and the away yellows. So just before I come to the TMO results, so we've got 3 models here. The difference across the models is whether we include year and team effects or not. So in the first model, this baseline model, we don't have year or team effects. Model 2, we introduce year effects, and in Model 3, we have both year and team effects. So it's fairly consistent with some of the control variables. So perhaps unsurprisingly, if the match is what we describe as a derby, so remember these are teams competing in the same country, typically involves more yellow cards, and this is the case for both the home team and the away team, although it's more significant and consistently more significant for the home team. Game time, so matches played in the evening, tend to result in fewer sanctions for the yellow card, fewer yellow card sanctions to the home team, no effect for the away team. The experience of the referee appears to matter in the sense of reducing yellow cards to both the home and the away team. And there's not much going on with attendances or how full the stadium is. Some marginal weak effects here in terms of away yellows, but it's relatively modest. But the kind of key aspect here is this is simply, so I'm not including the nationality of the on-field or the neutrality of the on-field referee. It was simply in this specification, in this set of results and the ones I'm going to show you in the next slide, we're just simply looking at what impact did the introduction of a TMO have. And you can see that in general it has a positive effect. You probably need to change the borders because you can't see the significance levels. Wish I could probably do that. I just couldn't see it at the bottom of the screen because the picture of James is still hovering on there, but that's fine. So I think it's a bit clearer, not much. But anyway, it's what happens for the home team and the away team. It's always positive, so it increases the number of yellow cards. But for the home team, the significance drops as you add in year and team effects, and it does the opposite for the away team. But in general, on balance, it seems like the introduction of the TMO has increased the number of yellow card sanctions to both the home and the away team. So we're doing exactly the same again, but this time look at the composite measure. So this, as I've said earlier, this combines yellow cards, red cards, and penalty tries, and you get a similar picture. So again, the TMO, the introduction of the presence of a TMO, and just to note something I didn't mention earlier, even though the TMO was introduced several years ago, it had been the case that not all matches would still involve a TMO. So there's still situations where in some contests, even though a TMO had been introduced, it's not the case that every single match involves a television match official. But nonetheless, we kind of try and control for potential year effects, which might also pick up things like rule changes and so forth. But you've got a similar story here in terms of increasing number of combinations of yellow, red, and red cards and penalty tries when the TMO is present. Again, the significance drops as you add year and team effects for the home team, and significance increases again for the away team. But again, it seems, again on balance, that more sanctions occur in the presence of a TMO. So that's okay. That's fairly interesting, I think, but it's not, doesn't actually take as much further than what we have previously considered when we looked at other rugby tournaments. So I've done a lot of playing around with this. So rather than be showing you endless slides of results, I'll try and summarize it in this on the basis of 2 slides. Okay, and I'll explain how we've done this. So, as I say, what we're interested in here is looking more at the kind of neutrality of the match officials. So those 2 sets of results I've just shown you is simply looking at whether there's a TMO present or not in the match. So what we're doing here is specifically looking at the on-field official. So does the on-field official does it have the same nationality as the home team? Do they have the same nationality as the away team, or are they neutral? In other words, they have a different nationality to either the 2 teams competing. And we do this across, obviously, when there are no TMOs and when there are TMOs. And we've done this in different ways. We've done this by splitting the sample. We've done this by using interaction terms, and the results are consistent across both constructions. So, and again, these are through our bivariate frameworks, and these are consistent across both the yellow card composition, or the yellow card, the yellow cards, and the composite measure. So, generally, not a huge amount is going on, but perhaps I think the most interesting, or one of the most interesting findings here, is that when you have an on-field official that shares the same nationality as the home team incurs fewer sanctions, and that's significant. But when the TMO is present, whilst the effect is still negative, it's no longer significant, so it drops out. So it seems to be maybe some evidence here that the TMO is acting as a kind of monitoring effect or a further monitoring effect in terms of the on-field official. What is perhaps slightly peculiar, I don't have a kind of convincing storyline for this, so any comments and suggestions to this would be welcome, is what happens when the on-field official shares the same nationality as the away team, or is indeed neutral. Because what we find here is, in the case of the on-field official having the same nationality as the away team, we do find a positive effect in terms of the number of sanctions to the home team, which kind of makes sense, but it's not significant. But it actually is significant when the TMO is introduced. So it's not abundantly clear, at least to me, why that would go up just for the away team in the presence of the TMO. And we get a similar story but different sign for when the on-field official is deemed neutral. So again, it's negative for the home. Sorry, in this case, it's negative for the home team, but again, insignificant. But then becomes significant, remains negative, but becomes significant in the presence of TMO. So those are a bit more peculiar. But I think this finding here is obviously one of the key ones in terms of our analysis here. And then the final thing I want to show you in relation to this is, okay, well, we've looked at simply whether there's a TMO or not, but what about the nationality or the neutrality of the TMO? So again, drawing upon what I showed you earlier, noting that for the majority of cases, the TMO is either deemed neutral or is a home TMO. We get, broadly speaking, exactly the same results as when we have a TMO present. So this is just a TMO. We're not making any distinction here between the nationality of the TMO in relation to the teams. So the results that we see here are exactly the same, regardless of whether it's a neutral TMO or a home TMO. And that perhaps, suggests it doesn't matter what the nationality of the TMO is. What perhaps matters is whether there's a TMO present in terms of decision making. Let me fairly briefly summarise, because I think I've got about 10 minutes left. I won't need to take 10 minutes. So essentially, if we've got a TMO, so an an off-field assistance. So the results suggest that this increases the likelihood of sanctions being issued to both teams, so both the home and the away team. When the on-field official shares the same nationality as the home team, as I've just shown you, the home team tends to be rewarded fewer sanctions, but this is only the case when there's no TMO. So when the TMO is present, this effect effectively disappears. And then there's this peculiar result, as I've just mentioned, that for an on-field official who's of the same nationality as the away team, there's an increase in the number of sanctions given to the home team, but this time only in the presence of the TMO. It's not there when the TMO is not present. And again, a similar finding for the neutral on-field official, but of the opposite side. And as I've just said, what seems to matter here is the presence of whether there's a TMO on the field available or in operation, rather than whether they're neutral or otherwise. Okay, so just a few concluding remarks. So what we've considered here is an investigation which looks at the role of the on-field official in sporting contests, looking at the decision making, specifically in the form of disciplinary sanctions, so yellow cards, red cards, penalty tries, and how this may be affected by the presence or otherwise of an off-field assistance or an official, so in our case, a TMO. So we found, in general, the presence of an off-field official increases sanctions, but obviously there is some evidence to suggest there's some bias when the off-field official shares the same nationality as the home team, but this is reduced when a TMO is present. Okay, that's me done. Thank you for listening, everybody. Happy to take comments.
Thank you, Peter. And I think Alex can confirm or deny this, but I think those of us that have been here listening to the talk have missed 2 shots on goal in what's been goalless so far between Sweden and Slovakia. So I think we've probably done better by listening to Peter's talk.
Marginally. Maybe it's not a big difference. Maybe those 2 shots on goal were really exciting 2 shots.
They could have been, couldn't they? Sarah Jewel wants to challenge you in the chat because she reckons that she has seen players who had 2 yellows who were given a red card in rugby, and so she does think that 2 yellows are equal to 1 red.
Okay, so but it's very, very rare. So obviously, thank you for pointing that out, Sarah. Not something I was aware of. I'll go and try and search my database of rugby data plus rugby video VHS tapes I have to see if I can uncover anything. But yeah, I wasn't aware that was the case. But it's extremely rare event, even if it is. But thank you for kind of challenging me on that statement I made earlier. I did have to make a confession to my father, who's a very big rugby league fan. For those that don't know, there's a difference between what's called rugby or rugby union and rugby league. James will probably know a little bit about it, being a northern boy as well. I had to tell him that I was presenting this. He was very disappointed, being a very league fan. So I won't be showing the recording. Or even if I did, he probably wouldn't watch it.
Fantastic. Well, there's nothing else in the chat. No, actually, no, there is now. Jonathan writes, is there a protocol for the scheduling of the referees, both on and off field, that takes their nationality into account, or are they scheduled purely randomly with respect to nationality?
So I think where possible, they do try and, obviously they know the scheduling of the game in advance, and they try and allocate, where possible, neutral kind of referees. But as I said earlier, there have been periods of time where, for financial reasons, they've had to drop the neutrality assumption. So where the on-field referee is neutral, there have been periods of time in some seasons where they've not been able to kind of use that, either because of the pool of referees available, or just the financial constraints. So have meant that they've had to use referees from the same nationality as say the home team, for example.
So it's not random then, it's basically dependent on.
Yeah, I mean, obviously where possible, they've tried to have neutral referees. In the sense of what we haven't looked at with the data is, if you've got an Irish and a Welsh team playing, is it more likely you get a Scottish referee? Again, it will depend on the pool of referees available. So some countries have a larger pool of referees to draw upon, whereas others don't. So there might be, for example, fewer Italian referees, I mean, I don't know, but there might be fewer Italian referees versus Welsh referees. And again, I think they also try and take into account the experience of the referees as well. But yeah, I don't think it's purely random at all.
Mm. What do you class? Because I guess there must be games between two Welsh teams and games between two Irish teams. And if it's an Irish referee and two Irish teams, is that classed as neutral in your?
Yeah, by definition, it's a derby match.
Yeah.
And we also we've done some sensitivity robustness analysis where we exclude derby matches, but then that just reduced the sample quite a bit because there are lots of derby matches there, given the composition of the teams involved in the competition. So, but we've done some robustness checks there, and the results very good.
Sarah then says, could you look at red cards versus yellow, given that the new directives are meaning a greater number of red cards and rules about mitigation determining if yellow or red? And then brackets, she writes, in relation to dangerous play, particularly contact with the head.
Yeah, and I think this is a very recent phenomena. Probably the kind of directive to that has been probably in the last few seasons. So again, our sample period predates that, and that's another reason why we use the sample period that we have used. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our intention is that we want to kind of expand this to the most recent seasons, but issues relating to kind of rule changes or directives to match officials, whilst we could argue to an extent are captured in these kind of year effects, we probably do have to be a bit careful in terms of modelling that. And obviously, maybe even though red cards have been relatively rare, maybe the frequency of them has increased in the last few seasons because of these kind of directives. So yeah, absolutely. And obviously the other thing that we might want to consider, or we are going to consider, is obviously the impact of COVID, because for this particular tournament, there's essentially a full season of no fans. So an addition here would be, well, look, if you take fans out of the equation, how does that affect just generally the decision making? But even though you may or may not have a TMO, I don't know from the data yet whether there are any instances whereby you have no fans and no TMO. I mean, that would be nice if you had that kind of combination. But I don't have a feeling there's probably TMOs are more prevalent in the most recent seasons. But yeah, thanks for the comment, Sarah, about the red cards and the kind of directives that might have an impact in terms of behaviour.
Great. Anyone want to put their hand up, ask a question, or put something in the chat? Stefan.
Hi, Peter. So one question I have is whether there's any impact in relation to context. So, I mean, how do these decisions affect the outcomes of games, and are these decisions more likely in very close games or in very uneven games? So it strikes me if there's a bias, it might it might not matter if it's a very uneven game, even if the TMO is biased or if the referees are biased, but it obviously would make a big difference to the outcome in a very close game. So have you any sense of that sort of significance?
Yeah, so I give you my very quick response. That would be, we're doing that in a separate paper. So we're looking at
I guessed you might say that.
Maximizing data set, because in this particular data set, we do have the outcome of the games, so we know the final score, but in a separate database, which is we've only just managed to put together in the last couple of weeks, we can see the score sequences, and we can see. So what the other thing I was going to add, and it was a slide which basically showed just one match. I mean, it's like one match, like one sample, whereby you had, I think it was Ospreys versus, it doesn't really matter, it was Ospreys versus Benetton, and it ended up being a very close game. It was actually, in terms of the slides, it was one of the games you mentioned here. So it was the Ospreys Benetton game where you had all four officials from Wales. Ospreys won, I think, 24-22, but they won in the last minute, and it won because Benetton had a player sin binned. So there was a period whereby there was like multiple sin binnings, and obviously each sin bin resulted in a try from the opposed, the team with the player advantage, for example. As I say, this is just one game. I'm not then translating this to a whole season or multiple seasons, but I think that anecdotally there seems to be some evidence that obviously, and why I mentioned it in the talk about having a more of immediate effect on scoring, because a player is ejected from the field. I mean, I still haven't seen very many series which look. I know there's been a few in ice hockey, looking at things like power plays and stuff like that. But in terms of whether teams are more likely to score when they have a player advantage, or whether they're more likely to score when that player returns to the field, or whether that has an effect on the final outcome, there's still relatively few studies in this area. And I think obviously
it's funny because, I mean, the commentators always say this. They always had the statistic, don't they? With a yellow card, the average number of points scored is 6 or whatever.
White Ball was the kind of classic one. He kept, several years ago, I listened to his commentary, and he said, "Oh, they're down to let's get it right now, 14 players." I'm talking about Union here. So they're down to 14 players. On average, the team with the man advantage will score 7 points. And I think, where's he getting? I have no idea where he's getting that figure from.
Well, they've got analysts out there, right? We're not the only ones looking at those numbers,
true,
right?
That's true. But this was years ago. This is well before analysts were kind of. I don't. Maybe they did have analysts 10 years ago, but he's been saying this stuff for years. But yeah, I think
Opta's been with us forever, haven't they? I mean, when did Opta goes back to the 90s, right?
Yeah, I don't think they were less interested in rugby in the 90s, maybe, than perhaps, I don't know. But yeah, absolutely. I get a sense that it could have an impact. I mean, it's something we haven't fully explored yet, but as I say, with this expanded data set, I think that's.
But my sense is the same as yours, is that I haven't seen much written about this, and it's kind of an obvious thing because in rugby it does seem to. I mean, there is as you say, anecdotally, there's a consensus that it does make a difference in rugby, and you can. Whereas in red cards and yellow cards in football, it's much harder, right?
Yeah, and
measure the impact.
I think my feeling of it was maybe, and again, it's just anecdotal. It's not based on hard evidence, but. Maybe there's more effort placed by the team who are down by, they're kind of galvanized. The team kind of come together and they kind of overperform to kind of compensate for the loss of player. But when that player returns, maybe their effort levels dip, and maybe they're more likely to concede in that period when they're back to a full complement in terms of that. But that was just speculation from kind of on my part. We have started to try and model that a little bit in some other sports a couple of years ago, but yes, definitely more needs to be done in this area, because ultimately you're right. I mean, it depends. So what if a team gets a yellow card and they're already 40 points behind. It doesn't really matter, but it can matter in, you know.
Well, but also you might think that it's an interesting question of whether referees are more likely to indulge their biases in situations where it doesn't matter. In other sense, when something's really on the line, they are concentrating, and bias creeps in when you're not really focusing properly. Might be one argument.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. Excellent point. Yeah. Thanks, Stefan.
Thanks, Stefan. In the process of this Q&A session, there's been 2 shots on goal, of which one has been a goal. Sweden has scored.
Have I lost viewers?
We're lower than you when you finish your talk, but I don't know whether that's directly related to the fact they've all gone off to watch.
No, I'm listening. I've got it on in the background, like I said, and it was a penalty.
So Sweden are now top in the group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bit of connection, not the penalties that we kind of know in football. So that's slightly different penalties.
Any more questions and comments?
And obviously, I'm happy. You've got my email address there, everybody. So if you've got any questions you want to ask me via email, you want to chat about it, I'm happy to take further questions or comments and ideas.
Should they say, I was put in the chat that anecdotally teams are getting better at handling periods when they are down a player or two, with red cards becoming more common.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So it might be that they're able to adapt because they've had lots of experience of kind of coping. I mean, obviously, it might also come down to who is the player that's been ejected. So does it differ between a forward and a back player, for example? So if you lose a forward, then you might potentially have uncontested scrums, for example, or the impact might be felt that much more acutely versus a player in the back division, for example. But yeah, they might well have adapted over time because they've had more experience of playing in periods of time when team members received a yellow card or indeed a red card. So yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Okay, any more questions and comments?
I think everybody's getting ready for the England-Scotland game, maybe. or to see if Slovakia can get an equaliser against Sweden.
This is true. They've got a few minutes left. What I was going to say, Pete, was you may have referred to it, but I think on this referee stroke umpire, being the same nationality as one of the teams competing, I think is it David Payton? Nottingham has done work on cricket with this, and I think they found LBWs were given less once the umpires were no longer of the same nationality, I think.
Yeah, and I should know about that because I have actually worked with David before, so and I feel bad that I haven't at least cited him in the slides because it was based on a cricket study as well. So I do apologise to. Yeah, I think that's right. I think there is some further evidence there. I mean, the studies I picked were slightly self-serving. There are some of mine, but they were also specific. Those were specific to rugby in terms of nationality. Obviously, there are studies on the American sports as well, the NBA, for example, the Price and Wolfers paper in terms of referee teams, or the referee crew, as they call it in the NBA. So, but yeah.
Okay, well, there is no more questions, and there is make it 6 minutes plus added time left of Sweden versus Slovakia.
The added on time in the Sweden game. Let's hope there's a goal.
Yeah, exactly. But thank you very much, Peter, for a very interesting talk. I think it's our first on rugby, but I couldn't be sure. But either way, very interesting talk on home advantage and on the behaviour of officials. So thank you very much for that, Peter, and thank you for everyone for your questions and comments. Next week is slightly unusual. And you may well have been spammed by me in the last day or two with notifications for events next week. But next Thursday and Friday is the 8th Math Sport International Conference taking place notionally at the University of Reading, but of course in reality on Microsoft Teams. You're all welcome to attend as members of the team for Roses. There will be a Roses event on the Friday afternoon with a number of talks, nested within a much broader program of very interesting talks on a range of different sports and a range of different issues relating to sport from folk from a range of different fields as well, operations research, maths, physics, as well as economics. So please do join us next week when we take a little bit of a break from the usual schedule. And it's also those next Thursday and Friday are the 2 days between the group stages and the last 16 of the European Championships. So you'll have nothing else to do, so you might as well join us for that conference for those 2 days. But I've taken up 2 of those final few minutes of the Sweden-Slovakia game, so I'm going to stop now and wish you all a fantastic weekend. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Cheers, Peter. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, James. I'm going to try and get to as many as I can next